r/AskReddit. A man once told me if you want a good story just ask any random person if there was ever an event in their life they cannot explain. Someone almost always has one weird thing that has happened to them. So Reddit, regardless of whatever you believe about the world, do you have a story as such? Bonus points. Ask any older pilot ever. They always have an awesome story. I come downstairs and see grandma at the dining room table. She is about to say something. Mongoose is the only thing I can think to myself. No matter what she is about to say, the answer is mongoose. I have no idea why I'm thinking this. I don't know what she's doing. I haven't read or seen anything recently to make me think of the critters. And I can't fathom why this thought has popped into my head. I look over and see her doing a crossword puzzle and she spits out what she wanted to ask me: what is the animal that kills and eats snakes? That was at least 15 years ago and it still bothers me to this day. A couple of years ago on Black Friday I woke up with an eerie feeling. Like something was wrong. And just had an overall uneasy feeling that freaked me out. It was about 2 AM at the time. So I walked upstairs and stood in my parents' kitchen. Not even a minute later my mom walks out and asks me if I'm feeling weird. I say yeah. And that it was keeping me up. She says she is feeling the same way. And we just stand there for a minute or two in silence. Suddenly the phone rings. And it's my grandmother. Apparently my grandpa woke up around 2 with chest pains. And was being rushed to the hospital. He was about 5% blockage away from the widowmaker. And also suffered a minor stroke. My mom and I are very close to my grandpa and grandma. But it still gives me the chills to think that we could have possibly felt something was wrong while it happened. I have a weird skill. I don't need alarm clocks. I just check the time when I go to bed. Pick the time I need to wake up. And bam. Within 5 minutes of that time I will wake up. I am completely incapable of keeping track of time when awake. Oddly enough. I once was driving in the University District of Seattle. WA in the middle of the night, probably 1 AM or so. It was just me and one passenger. We aren't from Seattle and were waiting a light to make a U-turn to find the freeway again. We were the only car at the intersection. But we waited about 3 minutes while the light was red. As soon as our light turned green, a huge marching band, presumably UWs, began to march across the intersection and into the lane we wanted to turn into. At 1 AM. Every single member was in costume. And they were not playing their instruments. It was incredibly eerie and my passenger and I were just sitting there open-mouthed. We both remember it exactly the same. But it was one of those memories that you think, did that actually happen? Not that cool. But pretty random. A few summers ago I went prospecting camping with my son and his dad in a national forest in southern Oregon. Our claim was miles away from the nearest town up some truly scary forestry roads. We set up camp close to a stream in a big clearing. One night we were playing cards and I heard a almost guttural scream. So and his dad had been drinking and they were being so loud they missed it. After getting them to shut up for a second, I heard the scream again but from a different location. The second scream sounded more feminine or something like that. Anyways. That night we heard what sounded like someone putting their arms in the stream and lifting them out over and over again. I kid you not. It sounded like something was effing washing something in that stream. We also had rocks thrown at our tent. This was the worst night of my life. I have never been so scared. It's worse because I can't put reason behind any of those occurrences. Edit. TLDR. Bigfoot screamed at me. Played in a stream. Then threw rocks at my tent. My grandfather was an amazing lawn bowler. He contended on a national level. It was his life after he retired. He loved the game. About 10 years ago, he passed away from a severe brain tumor. The day after he was buried, his bowling balls disappeared. And to this day we can't find them. Pretty eerie. But awesome. Nothing interesting ever happens to me. But a friend used to work on what I'd call a corporate farm. He was sent out to do field work with a tractor but it was at night. He was out in the wide open of the field when something hovered over the tractor and illuminated the spot he was on with a powerful orangish light. Hovered for a bit and then it was gone. There was no sound accompanying it. He's not the sort that goes in for boisterous stories and tales of bravado. It just scared him and the story came out of him one day. When my mom was in her 20s. She went on a 6-month boat trip with her boyfriend and other friend. One night they were just sitting at the front of the boat and they saw a light in the sky. It was glowing brighter and brighter and then shrank down to a small dot in the sky. It then zoomed off into the sky. The next day, an army boat was passing by and asked them if they had seen anything strange and they told them. The army men told my mom that it was just them practicing shooting missiles. However, it was the only army boat they ever saw during their whole 6-month trip. She still says she doesn't believe it was army practice. My first words were a sentence. We were at a parade. And suddenly, after never having said anything before, I turned to my parents and said, before I picked you guys to be my mom and dad, I was a soldier. And we used to march like that. This came out about 16 years later in family therapy. I have 2 interesting stories. And they are both almost the same. I had this really intense and vivid dream that involved hills of broken red rock. And a cabin. I ran to the cabin because there were zombies everywhere. I get into the cabin and find my best friend in there with a trunk full of guns. He wordlessly hands me a shotgun and the rest of my dream is a total zombie kill fest. I woke up and ran over to my buddy's place just like most school-free days. I was so totally pumped from my awesome dream that I couldn't wait to tell him about it. Well, when I get to his place, he's all shaken up and looks like hell. He told me that he had this horrible nightmare about being trapped in a little shack in this place all made of broken red rock and he had to fight off zombies all night long with me until we were back to back unloading with shotguns like crazy. I had never heard of dream sharing until that day. When I was in middle school, about 10 years ago, I was in the music room one day after school. Probably for a play practice or something. It was probably cool out because I had on a kind of windbreaker jacket. Anyway, there were a few other people in the room. Sitting at a table and talking and looking at someone's pet tree frog they'd brought to school for whatever reason. I was walking on the risers in the back of the room. Facing the only people in there. The only things behind me were a tiny window that didn't open in any way. And an empty shelf. As I was walking towards the other people when something hit me in the back so hard it knocked me down on my knees. It was sharp. Like getting shot with a BB gun or something. And a few minutes later I had my friend look at my back. And in one spot. It was swollen and bruised and bleeding and there was a gash about an inch long. This is something that still bothers me to no end. There was no hole in my jacket or my shirt or anything. Even though the cut was fairly deep. I've thought about this thousands of times over the years. And I can't think of anything that could have caused that. When I was about 10 I went swimming in a river and when I looked to my right I saw an arm just floating there without a body in sight. I screamed and got my ass out of that damn river. To this day no one believes that it happened. I have 2. One I directly witnessed. One I didn't. The first is my mom's. Back in the 70s. She lived in an old house in uptown New Orleans that had been converted to apartments. Weird stuff used to always happen. Like she would come home from work and her dresser would have been moved to the opposite side of the room. Everyone that had a key to her apartment, landlord, etc., denied entering or touching anything. Well, one night, she was sleeping when she felt someone crawl into bed next to her. No one was there. She moved out after that. The second happened at my aunt's wedding, which was held at my house. My aunt was getting married for the first time at the age of 51. My grandmother, her mom, had died approximately 16 years earlier. All day weird stuff kept happening. Like doors flying open and then suddenly getting stuck shut. The strangest was when the doorbell, which had been disconnected for months, kept repeatedly ringing. My aunt chalked it up to grandma making her presence known. One day my sister was scratching at her arm and had a little bump about 5 centimeters up from her elbow. She kept scratching at it and we asked her what it was and she replied that she didn't know and she had just woken up with it. She sat down and we were all curious by this time so I asked her what she was going to do about it. She said she wanted to cut it out. So she got a scalpel, she's a nurse. Pretty handy, and some gauze and asked me to hold the gauze in case it started bleeding. She only had to make a tiny little cut because she was going to squeeze out the pus. When she squeezed, no blood came out. Just a tiny little bit of metal. It was about 1/5 of the size of a grain of rice. She said it was itching her like crazy. We were all pretty confused. We put it in a container that she had in her med bag. A little clear one with a yellow lid. So we could have a look at it and she could take it to work and ask people what it was. A few days later I asked her whatever happened to the bit of metal. She had no idea what I was talking about. She did have a tiny little mark on her arm. But nobody that was there remembers it except me. There were about 5 of us there at the time. My grandmother would always fuss at my grandfather for not closing the mini blinds in the formal living room the right way. Apparently the right way doesn't let sunlight reach the carpet. Grandmother was unable to use the stairs in her final days, so a bed was set up in the formal living room as it was the biggest room and allowed room for the medical equipment and was closest to the kitchen and front door as she had many visitors. Several years after she passed away, I was house sitting by myself while Gramps was out of town. After arming the alarm system, which covered every entrance and exit and would chime any time a door was open to verify was working, I closed the blinds the wrong way and closed the curtains. The next morning I came downstairs to find all the curtains open and the blinds turned the right way. Alarm still armed. All exterior doors have the deadbolts which do not have an external key. You can only open them from inside the house. So yeah, that freaked me out alright. This isn't a spooky story and has nothing to do with aliens. But there's something that happened to me when I was younger that I've never really been able to explain. I was in the countryside with a friend of mine. And we thought it would be a good idea to climb a fence into what looked like an empty field. When we reached the middle of this field, we saw a huge bull and it charged at us. Needless to say, we immediately panicked. We started running back to the fence. I tripped. But my friend didn't notice and he kept running. I got up. And this fucking bull was still charging. And I ran full sprint to the fence and literally jumped over it. Without even touching it. I had to climb this fence to get in earlier. It was at least 6 feet and I was maybe 13 years old. But somehow I managed to clear the whole thing in one jump. My friend said it was the craziest thing he'd ever seen. I still have no idea how I did that. I guess when you think your life is on the line you can do some crazy shit. Every summer my family goes to the Irish festival on Harriet Island in St. Paul. In order to buy food at the festival, you have to go to a tent and buy food tickets. My sister and I were standing a good 50 feet away from the tent, talking and waiting for my parents to come back with the tickets. I randomly felt someone lightly scratching my back. Normally my sister and I will do this to each other from time to time because we both like it. But about 5 seconds later, the scratching had stopped. I immediately turned around to ask my sister to continue. Only she was at the tent, standing next to my mother, 50 feet away. There was no one else within at least 30 feet of me. I had turned around too quickly for anyone to run that far away from me that quickly. The scratching continued to happen randomly throughout the rest of our time at the festival that day. It scared me shitless each time it happened. Weirdest event. I knew a friend was going to die at least a year before she did. 3 months ago I told another friend about this premonition and then didn't think much of it until 3 weeks ago when I learned that my friend had actually died. I don't know how or why I knew it and it torments me almost daily. A friend of mine was hearing weird noises underneath his house. He said he also was creeped the hell out by it and felt weird vibes from the house. They had just moved in. But I ignored that part like a skeptic boss. I was over one time during the day, which hampers the horror movie quality of the story I guess, and he stopped me mid-sentence and alerted me to a tapping noise. Then a slam. You can access underneath the house from outside as there is a door underneath the back porch. So we go down to find it sitting wide open. There was no significant wind at all. We just stared at the door for a while. Mild urination occurring as we were alone. Nothing happened for a good 15 seconds until to our complete and utter horror, we watched as the door swung closed and locked itself. The lock is a bolt that has to be pushed really firmly through a bracket on the door frame. He tells me it still happens all the time. One night I had friends coming over. But I didn't know exactly what time. It was between 5 and 7 or something. I'm sitting at a table next to the door with another friend just chatting. Then suddenly I decide to get up and open the door. I really could not explain why. I was just compelled to. Our other friend was outside the door and had his hand raised to knock. Frozen in shock that I'd opened the door just like 1 second before he was going to knock without any prompting. Later that evening, we were at dinner sharing some appetizers. At one point, again I really couldn't say what compelled me. I grabbed the bottle of ketchup and handed it to my friend, same one that I opened the door on, literally 1 second before he starts saying please pass the, wait, how did you know I was going to need that? It was super creepy. One time I was hanging out with 2 friends and completely out of nowhere one of the friends and I said in unison I smell bologna. After a few moments of confusion, the third person confirmed no bologna smell in the room and neither of us have eaten bologna since childhood. This moment has haunted me for years. So my out of town friend's parents have this oldish farmhouse on property they own. His grandparents used to live and farm there until they retired. But the land stayed in the family. They will not rent out the house to anyone for any reason. This event helped prompt that decision. One afternoon I was out with my friend, we'll call him John, and his buddy on the property shooting each other with paintball guns. It's early afternoon, and we decide to take a break in the house. An empty, somewhat eerie house is irresistible to brave young lads like ourselves. At one point I am standing with John in one of the main rooms, while his friend is still in the doorway. Out of nowhere, John is thrown to the ground towards the door, as if someone shoved him hard in the back. I whirl around, of course, and see nothing. All 3 of us booked it out of there. I don't know what on earth happened in that house, but I'm not going in again. That's for sure. When I was maybe 14 I was riding my bike and I thought it would be cool to go between the 2 posts on a sign. As I got close to it, I realized that my handlebars were not going to fit. But it was too late to stop or turn. I wasn't wearing a helmet either. The next thing I knew, I was standing on the ground the other side of the sign safely on both feet. And my bike was just leaning against the sign. I really don't know what happened. A woman, when I was 6, came up to me, hugged me, and claimed to be my mother. She was able to tell me my name and my dad's name. I've always been suspicious of this, but as far as I know, I am the child of my parents. One thing that's always made me wonder is that she had blonde hair like I do. My dad had lung cancer and I had a trip scheduled with my boyfriend. I decided to take the trip because dad seemed fine. He was going to the doctor, etc. Day 6 of my trip and it's 3 AM. I wake up in tears. I'm sobbing. I have never once cried in my sleep. Not even when I was a little child. My boyfriend keeps asking what's wrong but I don't know. Morning. I call my mom to check in. Little brother answers the phone and tells me that dad is dead. He died at 3 AM. The weird thing is that I was never extremely close to my dad. There was always a strange bitterness behind our relationship because I could remember all the shitty things he did to my mom. I still don't even fucking know. My uncle bought a house about 10 years ago. One night in the autumn he kept hearing a knock on his door and when he went to answer nobody was there. After the 4th time he answered the door he looked down and saw a small dog with a woman's head resting on its back. He slammed the door shut and ran to his room. He was in complete shock and told no one about the story. He always assumed he was hallucinating or just going crazy. Then a few years later he was at a neighbor's Christmas party when the women that owned my uncle's house prior to the man my uncle bought the house from approached him. They made small talk for a few minutes when the woman said to him, "I have to ask you, have you ever seen the dog?" Every time I hear my uncle tell the story it gives me the chills. When I was 19, I got rear-ended by an 18-wheeler. The responding officer said the truck hit me at about 30 miles per hour. I was stopped. The force of the impact broke my seat in two at the hinge point between the base and back, pushed my bumper through my gas tank, and bent the body and frame of the truck so bad neither door would open. The kicker? I walked away. No earthly explanation at all. The cops said I should have been dead. The EMTs and ER staff said I should have been dead. TLDR, I got in what should have been a fatal accident and walked away. In 1996 my grandma died. A couple of years prior, my uncle had come to town for a visit and brought his cat. During his stay my grandma accidentally let the cat outside. It bolted away and was never seen again. On the night we had the open casket showing, we came back to my grandparents' house. On the front step sitting by the door was the cat. He had an ear tattoo. It was the same cat. I remember when I was around 9-10 and my uncle coming down the drive and doing his usual greeting to me by throwing me up in the air and catching me again. I ran inside to tell my mum that he had arrived. When I stopped, she was crying and on the phone. After she put down the phone, she turned to me and said, "Your uncle has just had an accident at work and won't ever wake up again, still to this day." I have no idea how that thought hallucination happened just moments before I learned of his death. In high school, my friends and I would sneak out of our houses and drive to the beach in the middle of the night. The beach is huge and we would run up and down it and splash in the water. One night, after about an hour of running around, the friend who drove realized he had lost the key at some point. The key wasn't on a keychain, it was just a single key, and we knew we would never be able to find it and basically we were fucked. We searched up and down for an hour but we knew ultimately we would have to call one of parents to pick us up. I sat down on the beach while someone made the call and dug my hand deep, like 6 inches, into the sand and felt something. I grabbed it and pulled it out. It was the key. Seriously, divine intervention. Well, I'm going to have a hard time sleeping after reading this thread. While in undergrad, I was doing some research that involved soil sampling. I regularly sampled several sites in a wilderness preserve, which would take most of the day to hike through. I always brought a friend, just for safety's sake. There was this one site, way in the rear of the preserve, that always spooked me. No real reason, it was no more isolated than the rest of the sites. But something about it didn't seem quite right. My friend and I were there once, and I was crouching over to sample the soil. I was looking down, and totally unprovoked, I felt this rising terror. Just a fuck this, run feeling. I stood up suddenly, and I could see that my friend had the feeling. She said, "We have to leave now." We ran the entire way to the car. We still have no idea why we felt that way, but I am convinced that there was a very real danger in staying. This thread feels like we're all around a campfire holding flashlights under our faces and telling ghost stories. When I was in 6th grade, my grandfather died. I was in English class, sitting in the front row and doing my class walk. All of a sudden I felt a strong kick in the gut. Whatever happened, it was forceful enough that it made me bend over my desk in pain and brought me to tears. But it went away as fast as it came, and I was just fine a moment later. Out of curiosity, I looked at the clock in the back of the room, and it was about 10:30. I went home at the end of the school day and found out that my grandfather, who I was very close to, as my grandparents raised me, had died around 10:30. I really wish I could have an explanation of what happened. Thanks for watching. Make sure to smash that like button and ring the bell for more daily high quality content. Do not forget to subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.